Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here this evening. We are going to get started, but don't worry, you will still be able to order food. My name is Tara Laidlaw. I am Southern Oregon Land Conservancy's Education Program Manager. And tonight I also get to be your MC for our first in-person pub talk since 2019. We are just so excited to be back together in person. And thank you also for sticking with us through some surprise winter weather rescheduling a couple weeks ago. None of us saw that one coming. Anyway, the goal of our Pub Talk program is to connect folks with the lands that we protect, to inspire curiosity, get you excited about this really magical region that we call home. And I'm sure that our lineup of speakers tonight is going to make that happen. Our theme tonight is the Agate Desert. And the Agate Desert is a really special landform up near Eagle Point that has some really unusual underlying geology and soil structure that has in turn resulted in some truly special and unique adaptations in the ecosystems above ground. I don't want to steal too much of the thunder from our speakers, so I'll leave it there. But I will say that unfortunately, only about 17% of the Agate Desert landform is still intact. Fortunately, Southern Oregon Land Conservancy has a conservation focus area that includes the Agate Desert. It's called the Agate Desert Middle Road Focus Area. And in that focus area, we protect about 1,000 acres using both conservation easements on private property and ownership of lands, including a couple of properties that recently came into our care from the Nature Conservancy. If we have any folks in here who have visited Whetstone Savanna or the Agate Desert Preserve, anyone? Yes, fabulous. Okay, so you have already visited that conservation focus area. And the Rogue River Preserve is also within that focus area. Has anyone here visited the Rogue River Preserve? Yes, it is a truly magical place. So if you have been to any of those properties, you've gotten a little bit of a sneak peek at the Agate Desert, which is our topic this evening. Now, before I introduce our first speaker, we just have a couple of logistics and housekeeping. In case you missed it on your way in, we do have a raffle going this evening. We have a bottle of Troon Vermentino. Oh, Amber's got it over here. And a Vino Trek wine flask. I'll be perfectly honest, I don't actually know what that is, but it sounds really cool. It's for hiking. Also, you can take your wine while you hike and camp. Okay, I need to get myself some raffle tickets. Tickets are $1 each, or you can get 6 tickets for $5. You can flag down Amber or another staff member, and we will be very happy to help you get your name in the hat. And Steve, our fabulous executive director, will be pulling the lucky winner at the end of the evening, so be sure to stick around. Now, speaking of the end of the night, we are not going to be doing a traditional moderated Q&A. Instead, we're going to have about a half an hour of time to just kind of mingle and chill. Our speakers are going to be sticking around, and we encourage you to find them in the crowd and ask your questions one-on-one. I will say that we need to be out the door at 8 o'clock, so we won't have a lot of time to mix and mingle, but please do feel free to flag them down in that half hour. I want to give a special shout out to Grape Street. They are not usually open on Tuesdays, and they've opened just for us. Especially to this fabulous, amazing person taking all of the orders and delivering your food onto the floor. Truly exceptional. They will be taking orders up there at the bar all evening, so feel free to pop back there at any time if you need a refill. Restrooms are around the back corner, right there. And do we have any other announcements? Did I get it? Okay, great. So I am now so delighted to honor and to welcome our first speaker, David West. He is an enrolled member and elder of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation, and he's the Director Emeritus of the Native American Programs at SOU. He's been a member of the Oregon Indian Education Association for 35 years, and he's also a member of the National Congress of American Indians. Please join me in welcoming David to the stage.
Might clip this too for audio for the.
Bonjour, Nakan. Ani nanijina. Wabaski benish chilstanen. Andaxklich, Anishnabe, Nijnabeg, Bodawadme, Kankaki Wabash. Can you hear me back there? Okay. I don't often need a microphone or a megaphone. Creator blessed me with this good big voice. And so I try to use it the best that I can. I said to you, hello, my relatives. How are you this day? Yeah, good, good. We're an oral tradition people. We did our very best to talk to each other. So I always invited my students to talk to me. Mine wasn't a classroom where you had to sit and be quiet and not look out the window. In fact, I encouraged that because that's sometimes where visions happen, is out the window when you're thinking. It's my pleasure to be here with you. I am from the Potawatomi Nation with Miami and Kickapoo descendancies, as well as French and German. I'm a third generation Oregonian on my dad's side, which is Pennsylvania Black Dutch. And my Indian folks came here in 1920, and all of them settled or were settled in the area around Buncombe on the Little Applegate. My dad was a Caterpillar mechanic for 32 years with Crater Lake Machinery. All of my aunts and uncles had dairy farms on the Applegate around the Cantrell Buckley area. And my cousin made some of the very best jerky you ever flopped a lip over. His name's Gary West. So it's my pleasure to be here with you today, and in particular to talk about our home and the land that we live in. And so I'd like to start today with the land acknowledgement that was created with Southern Oregon University faculty and staff and members of the 9 federally recognized tribes of Oregon that had occupancy in Southern Oregon in historic times. In our desire for collective healing and partnership, we offer this acknowledgement of Indigenous peoples and their connections to the land that Medford and the Grape Street Grill occupies. This acknowledgement was developed in conversation between Grand Ronde tribal staff, Siletz tribal staff, and Native American programs faculty and staff at Southern Oregon University. It continues to be a living statement through this ongoing partnership. On behalf of the Southern Oregon Land Conservancy, I would like to take this moment to acknowledge that we are located within the ancestral homelands of the Shasta, Takelma, and Latgawa peoples who lived here since time immemorial. These tribes were displaced during rapid Euro-American colonization, the gold rush, and armed conflict between 1851 and 1856. In the 1850s, discovery of gold and settlement brought thousands of Euro-Americans to their lands, leading to warfare, epidemics, starvation, and villages being burned. In 1853, the first of several treaties were signed, confederating these tribes and others together, who would then be referred to as the Rogue River Tribe. These treaties ceded most of their homelands to the United States, and in return, they were guaranteed a permanent homeland reserved for them. At the end of the Rogue River Wars in 1856, these tribes and many other tribes from Western Oregon were removed to the Siletz Reservation and the Grand Ronde Reservation. Today, the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde Community of Oregon and the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians are living descendants of the Takelma, Shasta, and Latgawa peoples of this area. I encourage you to learn about the land you reside on and to join us in advocating for the inherent sovereignty of Indigenous people. Thank you. I was a classroom teacher for 32 years, a university professor for 21 years. I learned the history of the United States from the indigenous perspective, in accordance and in balance and in communication with history from contemporary sources and from the time of the colonizer. That just works out a whole lot better saying the colonizer than it does saying those white people. That's not very pleasant sometimes. So we've tried to do better in our communication. Teaching the history of the westward expansion of the colonization of America is a difficult one, particularly the historical period of contact. Things didn't work out so well in our relationships. And so the people from here, it says they were removed, but in reality, they were ethnically cleansed from the Klamath River and the Cascade Mountains as far up as about Corvallis, and all of those people were put on the reservation at Siletz. And from the Columbia River south to about Salem, west of the Cascade Mountain Range, the people were rounded up at gunpoint and forced removal to the reservation at Grand Ronde. There was an earlier reservation just off of Tolo Road in Southern Oregon. It was the Table Rock Reservation. Then also the Great Reservation, the Great Coastal Reservation, was located in the area around Yachats on the Oregon coast. And that was determined to be way too much land for a reservation for that few innings. So they put them onto the Siletz and Grand Ronde reservations and closed the Yachats Reservation. The history of the people goes back to time immemorial. One of the main forms of education was storytelling. And so this story, I heard grandmother Agnes Baker Pilgrim, of whom I am adopted into her family as her son, and was asked to welcome people on her behalf to her home. So welcome to Southern Oregon, the land of the Takelma people. Her father was one of the first judges at the Siletz Reservation, and her grandfather was the first chief of the Confederated Tribes of Siletz at the removal time. But she told this story. We're going to talk about the Agate Desert. We're going to talk about Sam's Valley. Do you know why it's called Sam's Valley? Because there was a Takelma war chief named Sam. Hi, Sam. Most indigenous tribes did not have the word chief. It was Tai for the people out here. For my people, it was Shasham. It was a wise person, a big person that led the people. And grandmother is descendant from those big people. And in her own right, she was a big person. She made a tremendous impact on the world through her efforts with the 13 indigenous grandmothers who traveled literally all over the world doing ceremonies and support for water. And that was one of her main things that she did. But she told this story. And so I'm going to tell you this story about how Sam's Valley came to be from one of the perspectives. Now, there are two stories. One has the one that is the version that I'm going to tell tonight, and the other is a version that is a bit different in the telling. And after I tell it, maybe you'll see the difference in the version, or I'll be glad to share that with you. But to start off, they say it happened in a long ago time. That there was a person, there was a young man that was born to the people. And everybody knew that this young man was very, very special and had great abilities and gifts that only the Creator could have bestowed upon this little boy. And so the old teachers, they took him and they trained him in the ways of medicine. They trained him in the way of ceremony. They trained him in the way of reciprocity and of being humble with his gifts and to ensure that he used his gifts and abilities in a proper way on behalf of the people and all our relations. And so for many years, the young man did his training, and he worked very hard to become a medicine person, a Goya. He married a beautiful woman, and they had 2 children, a son and a daughter. And after a while, he got such a reputation. He was so good, and his abilities were so immense. They were so powerful that the people would call upon him for all manner of things, and they would gift him, which is traditional, because he wouldn't ask for a price traditionally. It was what he could give to help the people. And so in reciprocity, they would give back to help support the Goya. But as human nature sometimes factors in, the Goya became too big of himself. And he began to think himself above the people. And so he started asking for things and taking things from the people as he would work on them, as he would doctor to them and care for them as a healer. And pretty soon he got greedy and he began to take more and demand it because of his gifts and his abilities and what he was doing for others. And after a while, it got such that he had gathered up most of other people's things. And so the people, they got together and they sent a voice to the ear of the Great Spirit. They said, look what this evil Goya, this Goya that's become evil now, look what this evil Goya is doing to us. What are we to do? We need your help. We need your help. And so the Creator, hearing their plea, sent the red-tailed hawk, the protector bird, the warrior bird, to go deal with this Goya. Tell this Goya that it must stop misusing the gifts and abilities that were given on behalf of the people and all our relations. And so the red tail went and talked to the Goya and said, now look, the Creator is not happy with you. Those gifts and abilities that you have came from that one that gave you life. You can't misuse these. You have to straighten up now and go back to the way that you were supposed to take care of the people. Don't be greedy. Don't think yourself above anyone. Be humble. But the Goya, unfortunately, being so full of himself and so big-headed, as they might say, that he ignored the warning of the red tail. And then he was angry. And so in his anger, he used his gifts and his abilities to strike out at the people and to bring hardship and despair on them. He brought a great flood, it said, and wiped out all of their winter food, wiped out all of their winter homes, the places that they were going to live, the hard work that they had done all through the summer, gathering the foods that would get them through the wintertime were washed away. And now the people were wet and cold and tired and hungry and had no home, had no food. And so once again, they hurriedly came together and they sent a voice to the Great Spirit. The Great Spirit called forth the red-tailed hawk and he said, "Nah, that's enough. You go take care of this. Go take care of this." And so the red tail flew rapidly to the evil Goya and told the Goya, "You got to stop right now." And the Goya said no, and so the fight was on. This was a spiritual fight, a physical fight, a mental fight, an emotional fight. It was a fight. Casting of abilities and magic, back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And finally, as we all know, good always overcomes evil. And so the evil Goya was worn down by the red-tailed hawk because the red-tailed hawk was doing the work of the Creator. And Creator assisted that red-tailed hawk in grasping the Goya in its talons. And as the red tail was lifting the Goya from the ground in its great and powerful wings, it swept off the tops of the two mountains that were there and scattered all the gravel at the base of the two mountains all around that deep, deep gravel. The bones of the mountains were scattered upon the ground. The red tail raised the evil Goya up into the sky, and now the two mountains were flat on top. And the red tail said, "You have to be punished. You've got to pay for what you did. When you misuse your gifts and abilities in a bad way and you bring hardship and suffering, that comes back to you. The same way that when you use them for good and for benevolent purposes that you're supposed to use them for, it comes back to you the same way. And because you've been so bad and you've brought so much hurt to the people, I must punish you. So I'm going to turn your wife, your son, and your daughter to stone. I'm going to turn you into a giant, big cedar tree, our healing tree, our medicine tree, cedar, our medicine tree. And I'm going to put you on top of that little table rock. And when I put you on top of that little table rock, the only way that you are ever going to come back to life is when enough people of the two-leggeds, the human beings, have come to the top of the mountain, the table mountain, and gathered needles from your limbs to help them in their medicine, to help them with their own gifts and abilities as they come there to pray and gather the cedar that they use in their smudge. And when they've gathered enough of those needles from your limbs to equal out the evil that you did, then I will return your wife, your son, and your daughter to human form, and I will bring you back to human form, and you will be the greatest of all of the Goyas, the doctors, to ever live. And so we know that there's truth in this story. Because if you travel up over Blackwell Hill and you look to your right, you'll see standing over there, you'll see 3 spires of rock on the north side of the little table rock. That's the wife, the son, and the daughter frozen in stone there. And if you look on top of Little Table Rock, you'll see that the largest tree that's growing there is a cedar tree. That's the Goya. And that's the valley. And if you look around out there, you'll also know that there's probably a lot of truth in this story. If you look how deep Knife River has dug into the gravel around the Table Rock. And so that's the story of the Table Rock from the Takelma people and grandmother Agnes Baker Pilgrim. Thank you for your time. You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. It is just such a treat to hear that story from a completely new perspective. And it's really an honor to have you here sharing with us, so thank you. Up next, we have Todd Rasling. She is a professor emerita of geography and environmental studies at SOU, where she taught geography and land use planning for 25 years. She's a past president of SOLC and Mr. Optimist International of Action, and she currently serves on SOLC's Lands Committee. The stage is yours.
It was such a privilege to work at SOU with David. Before any event, the opening of the school year, any ceremonial event, David would open our meetings with a prayer. And I always felt like I was really lucky to be at work that day. And I knew a lot of my friends, the ones at the Oregon Country Fair, wished that they could have my job. My story is going to be a little different than David's. There'll be a little more, the perspective will definitely be different than the Native American perspective. And I think that's an interesting contrast. So let's get going here. I thought we should define where we were visiting tonight. I am a geographer. Location and place are 2 of the themes of geography, and the map is the principal tool of the geographer. So you can see in this map, I don't think I'll use the pointer, I think I'll use my finger. The Agate Desert. It's a triangular space. You can see it's bordered on one side or in the center by the development of White City. We can see Central Point down in the bottom. Most of the Agate Desert happens to the north and east of Central Point. And trending through that area are Bear Creek and Whetstone Creek. I like this scale of USGS topographic map because you can see a lot. Now we use a scale that is smaller and shows a lot less detail. So perception of place is very important. And I think we have to start with the difference in perception that the Native American group had when they lived in this area versus the perception of the Caucasian settler when they arrived. So the Agate Desert is not a true desert. It actually gets 20 to 25 inches of rain every year. To be arid, you need to have 10 inches or less, or semi-arid is 20 inches or less. So if you go down the road just a few miles to Ashland, it's semi-arid, 19.85 inches average per year. But quite a lot of precipitation for a desert. The indigenous people used it as a breadbasket. It was a place that they traveled, as Mark Tveskoff, the anthropology professor at SOU, has noted. The meadows and river terraces were used seasonally for berries, camas, acorns, game. It was their home and where they derived their sustenance. So their vision of it was very different than the Caucasian settler who arrives from a humid East Coast where it rains year round to find that it did not rain in the summer here. So land that could be tilled and cultivated was important to them, and they could find it along the banks of the Rogue River or Bear Creek. But they looked at the Agate Desert and saw the gravels that were there, saw how the shallow soils dried out in the spring and summer, and to them it was a desert. So the name was given the Agate Desert, and it's with us today. And if you visit it now, it's lush and wet. Take a visit in August, and you will see how they arrived at that perception. So pioneers didn't claim it like they did the Bear Creek Valley, but they still encroached upon it and set up later conflicts, which we'll get to. But let's talk about the foundation. A little bit different story than David shared with you. So if we go back in geologic time, the area we live in now is called by geologists Laramidia, and it was really an inland kind of sea or lake, and I'll show you the boundaries. We're about right here, so you can see those inland lakes. And as time went by, all these mountains deposited their eroded sediments in these inland seas and in these lakes. Later, plate tectonics bring us the rise of the Klamath Mountains, which first would have appeared as islands in these seas, and later the Cascades. And that brings us to our modern day landscape. Underneath the gravels that David described are the sediments that were deposited in those times. Later, when the Cascade Range began to rise, there were lava flows. It's a little different creation story than David. One lava flow from around the vicinity of Lost Creek Dam made its way all the way down into the Rogue Valley, following the course of the ancient Rogue River. And geologists have done drilling and core samples to find the gravels and cobbles of the ancient Rogue underneath the Table Rocks. So over time, the surrounding valley was eroded, and you can see there's about 800 feet of relief from the top to the bottom of the Table Rocks. That's quite a lot of material to be eroded and moved downstream to places like Gold Beach. So that's where how this process occurred and where the sediments ultimately come from. Now, this is an exciting geologic slide. At least I thought it was exciting. I was so excited by it that I picked up a rock from this road cut to share with you. So over time, as the mountains surrounding the valley were eroded, the sediments that were created were deposited around the table rocks. And you can see the gravels that are there in the road cut. I brought a piece home for you to see. It's a chunk of rock, and it has the calcium carbonate cement on it that seals these stones together. So I'm going to pass it around. It's not valuable. So so these layers of gravels and clays have cemented with calcium carbonate, and they've also just been squished by gravity over time. And it's kind of cool if you're walking around out there, you can actually imagine that the sedimentary rock of the future is forming underneath your feet. Well, I guess you have to have a pretty good imagination for that. But that's the kind of thing that gets me relatively excited. So some places, these gravels are 70 feet thick. And that's, as David was mentioning, what they are mining at Knife River, formerly Leininger, on the margins of the Agate Desert. So it's pretty extensive. As the well logs have noted, about 15 square miles are underlain by this material that's becoming consolidated and has developed an interesting soil on top of it. And it's this material becoming rock and the soil that's developed on top of it that make the Agate Desert the special environment that we strive to protect at this point. So this is, the soil is called the Agate Winlow Complex, and a complex really is a place where there isn't there's such a diversity of soil patterns that we can't describe just one. So here, the agate soil is about 55% and the Winlow 35%. And there are several other significant local soils that are intertwined beneath them at points in the landscape. So it appears on the surface as what we call patterned ground. And they're actually circular or well, they're not really, some are circular, but mounds of the agate soil with the Winlow in between. And the agate is much deeper than the Winlow and is a permeable soil and grows a good hay crop. Doesn't do much if you're looking for a septic system site, though, I found when I worked for 4 years for Jackson County Planning and Development. Besides the fact that seasonally it's surrounded by water, the mounds are so small that they really don't have that use for humans. So that actually has kept it from being developed to a greater extent than we see. So here is a Southern Oregon Land Conservancy photo, and you can see those mounds and intermounds and the drainages that occur in between them, the vernal pools. And they're usually about 3% of slope. So I suspect that they drain not only on the surface, but through the mounds on the way to whatever local stream is available. And I also wanted to point out to you the strip of land in between the two sections of Agate Desert where people have smoothed out the mounds. They have likely taken a cat and ripped the substrate so that it will be drained better and have this smooth appearance. So this is what happened to the other 60 some odd percent of the Agate Desert, the smoothing out for human use. So here's a map that shows the Agate Winco. Ooh, now am I going grocery shopping? The Agate Winlow soil complex, and then the vernal pool critical habitat that's been identified that has radically changed the way we view the Agate Desert. So the patent ground, people talk about, well, how was it formed? I've heard some people say that perhaps it's moles and gophers and digging that has created this. And it could be that there are some physical elements that are like that, but it's more likely that it's the product of drainage, but of annual freeze-thaw events. You can see a photo there of some frost needles poking up the soil. And it's thought that over time, the larger cobbles and gravels are shunted off to the side, and these mounds of soil are what remain. There is always a layer of something that's impervious underneath, either basalt or a hard pan, or, as in the Agate Desert, this material that's rapidly becoming rock, or slowly becoming rock, I should say. So the humans in the Agate Desert, we've talked a little bit about the Native Americans and the view of it as a pantry, really, of something that was for sustenance and survival. Well, let's bring on the other, what geographers would call sequent occupants, because it's not uncommon for one group of humans to follow another in a place. So the pantry, acorns, camas bulbs, grasshoppers. Yes, grasshoppers. They might be in our future too. Parweed, deer, elk, fish, other plants, Klamath plum, hazelnut, serviceberry, ukau in the picture at the top, and yampa in the picture at the bottom, both corms and grains from these different plants. And then, of course, fire, which is a tool that we hope to use, as the Nature Conservancy has, to protect the plants that are there that have grown up with fire. Ooh. Did I accidentally hit a up? Just pushed another button. So here is a map of an 1855 survey. And David mentioned the reservation that was on Table Rock, and we can actually see it here. Indian reservation, boundary, separating lower Table Rock, and they had about half of upper Table Rock. And nearby, right here, Fort Lane, a military installation, which some folks say served not to keep the Native American folks in control, but to actually protect them from the settler group, which was often the source of conflict. Another perspective. So David took us through the story of the Takelma and being removed to the Siletz reservation. And really what that did was clear the path for a great deal more Caucasian settlement, and ultimately the landscape that we have today. This is a cadastral survey, or an ownership survey map from 1859. And we can see the land, all of the writing and description that you see is of land claims that were made by pioneers. I just wanted to include this one of the reasons was to show you no land claims in the Agate Desert. So it really was not viewed as desirable. Even though you could claim land for free, nobody claimed it. People, the surveyors put on their maps, second-rate soil, gravelly, but they did put that there was good grazing, and to this day, grazing is one of the principal uses on the agricultural lands that are there. And this is a photo of Everett Hanna bringing in hay from on the Rogue River Preserve for his cattle, and then, of course, the cattle themselves. Well, despite the fact that it was the Agate Desert, people still were interested in living there and in developing it. And so there were a couple of significant development schemes that were cooked up. In 1910, there's a great Jackson County map that has the ownership of every property in Jackson County in tiny, tiny, tiny little writing, and it notes the Jackson County Improvement Company, which morphed in to what was called Rogue Lands Irrigated Orchard Tracts. And it was this 55,000 acres. I mean, that is a big bunch of orchard property. Unfortunately, it wasn't orchard property. That's the only thing, the fly in the ointment, or the monkey wrench. Nevertheless, lots of 5 to 40 acres were marketed to folks on the East Coast, and they were going to build 389 miles of canal. Now, some of this canal did get built, and it's the Fish Lake and 4 Mile Lake and the early Rogue River Irrigation District and Medford Irrigation District roots are in this company. Oh, I'm going to skip this one. So paying attention to the ad here for the Rogue Lands property, it says on it that you could clear $500 per acre from your completed orchard, and they planted them and sold them as planted orchards to folks on the East Coast. But it didn't work out that way. And we see in Kay Atwood's book, Blossom and Branches, which is a really fun book if you get a chance to read it, that while most of the orchard lands were legitimate, some promoters were unscrupulous. Gullible prospective buyers were promised 2 pear crops a year from their trees, and they were told that the rocks on the desert land held heat to prevent frost destruction of the fruit. 400 acres were planted on the Agate Desert for unsuspecting customers in the north central and eastern states. The stock became worthless. And then from an article in the Table Rock Sentinel, which was a little journal published by the Southern Oregon Historical Society, Dolph Phillips, an orchardist, recalls, you know, any place they had a little dirt, somebody would speculate on it and plant trees. Maybe they'd have to cut the oak trees down and put the orchard trees in and sell it to the people back east. Where Camp White is now, the trees just died. The soil is just gravel. The investors lost all their money. Do you see the theme here about the investors losing their money? And then, one of my personal favorites, the rocky soil was too shallow to properly plant a tree, so holes had to be blasted just to get the trees in the ground. Unfortunately, the underlying hardpan prevented the water the orchardists imported from soaking in, and the trees eventually drowned. So they either drowned or dried up. But it was quite a boondoggle, and folks lost a lot of money. A big owner of the properties were the Welch family. And so after that, they diverted their efforts into improving the agriculture and improving the local cattle situation. Which one? 2, 7, or 5?
Any of them?
No.
Oh.
I'm not looking at you, I'm looking at them. Okay, I'm almost done. So, modern White City. Along comes War II, and whoops, we skipped a slide. And we see the government finding that White City is an interesting place for development to train military, in mostly because it was so much like the landscape in the Mediterranean War Theater. So thousands of people were there, bought in 1941, dedicated in 1942, short-lived. Okay, I'm pressing forward.
Oh, sorry, me.
That's you. There we go. So the Army left in 1945, and it left a huge hole in the economy. And people had a vision of what could be there. Residences, industry. So Glenn Jackson, who lived in Medford for a time, as did his daughter, he had a vision. He formed with others the White City Development Company, and voila, we have White City, born on the Agate Desert. And it was viewed as the place where the city of Medford could have industry. But that all changed when some little fairy shrimps were discovered. And we'll get there. I want just 2 more slides. I just wanted to tell you a little bit about Glenn Jackson. Had a huge impact on the state, envisioned I-5, which has had a dramatic long-term effect on the city of Medford, and also a little bridge over the Columbia and the Willamette in Portland. So our future, because we've done the past and the present, looks some more like this. We still have the industry, we still have the residential development, but look at all those preserved. Okay. Who do I give this next to?
Thank you so much, Pat. Up next, we have Dr. Nature. He is a chronic ecologist with a passion for conservation and environmental. He has been with SMU's biology department since 1994. I'll let you know on that. And I will say that the last time I saw him, he was catching lizards for like a completely enthralled group of children and adults, myself included, out of the Roe River Preserve at one of our open land stays. It is always a pleasure to have him here to share his expertise and his enthusiasm.
Thank you. Thank you. What fun this is, right? Yeah, thanks, Pat. And it's like old home week. A bunch of us taught at SOU for quite a long time. I failed at retirement. I retired last spring and I'm back. But what I want to do is sort of take a broad brush and paint for you some ideas about the kinds of organisms that live in these vernal pool habitats. And I titled my talk, Life in Temporary Waters, because vernal pools are just one example of these kinds of temporary waters. And as we'll see, hopefully you'll see, there's some adaptations, some things that organisms do to live in these really kind of harsh environments. And so where am I going to take you? I'm going to take you to the Mojave Desert and to Las Vegas. Why the hell would somebody talking about Agate Desert vernal pools start with a slide of Las Vegas? Probably because you're kind of taking a bet. You're gambling on coming to this event tonight, first of all. But I was actually a student here, and I grew up in the Pacific Northwest. And for me, aquatic organisms were salmon and trout that lived in big, fast-flowing rivers. And I went to graduate school in Las Vegas, Nevada. I think I was going to be a wildlife biologist. I was sort of this conflicted wildlife biologist botanist, because those were my 2 undergraduate advisors. And I got to the driest place in North America and became an aquatic ecologist. And I didn't do very well at stand-up comedy in Las Vegas, so I decided I'd go into teaching. So you don't see a hell of a lot of water in this part of the world. So why am I taking us here? Well, I've studied aquatic systems in the desert Southwest for a long time in a lot of different places. And there are two little circles here that I'm going to point out because they really do relate to our study of things that live in temporary waters. And well, I'm not going to spend a lot more time on that. I'm going to hone in on this. And those two places that I just circled, one is the Calico Basin, which are these beautiful red sandstone outcroppings in the Spring Mountains, just to the west of Las Vegas, Nevada. Some of you have probably been there and hiked around and climbed those rocks. And they form these beautiful rock pools that fill up seasonally if you get some seasonal rain. And the other place on the map is something completely different. It's this, it's this dry lake bed along Highway 93. And we used to drive by that when we were doing sampling for fish on the Colorado River. And we drive back and forth along this thing. And I always wondered about it. And so one day, and I knew it had held water at one time. I never saw water in there except in a few little puddles here after a big rain or something like that. And I asked my major professor, when was the last time that lake probably had water in it? And he said, well, I don't know, 70, 80, 90 years, something like that. So one day we were driving along and I parked the car right here and I ran out into the middle of the lake with an old yogurt container and I scooped up a bunch of the sediment and I ran back to the lab and I put a little tank on my desk and filled it with water and threw that sediment in. Went off to do what graduate students do in Las Vegas and came back on Monday morning. And it was just sort of this, wow, just add water. And literally from a Friday afternoon coming back to the lab to a Monday morning coming back into the lab, the tank was just loaded with stuff. And over about a 2-week period, it got even more loaded with stuff. And the stuff it was loaded with, the thing that really jumped out at me initially were the copepods and some of the water fleas. And then over time, the fairy shrimp started to molt and get bigger. And this is the Arizona prairie shrimp. No, this is the red-tailed prairie shrimp, one of the streptocephalus species. And over time, we saw things like rotifers, these tiny little rotifers. They made the water cloudy. So we took a sample and looked at it under the microscope, and there's a bunch of rotifers. There were even some insects, some chironomid midge larvae that started to develop in this tank. And it sort of solidified my interest in aquatic organisms. And then we would go out to the red rocks and see the same suite of organisms, not the same species, but we'd see the same kinds of organisms that lived in those rock pools in the Calico Basin. And so I was sort of hooked, although that's not what I did my research on for my graduate degree, but I really became hooked on these things and still am, as you might tell. So anyway, just add water and boom, here's what you get, an old lake bed that's probably not seen water for close to a century. And then I finished graduate school. I went off and did a bunch of other things. And I sort of ended up in Ashland at Southern Oregon University, my alma mater. Luckily, they had sort of forgotten me as an undergraduate, wasn't willing to offer me a job. And I'd been here for about a year, and Darren Borges with the Nature Conservancy came to me one day and said, we're thinking about doing these surveys. We have these vernal pools on the Agate Desert and on Table Rock and places like that. We're wondering if you might want to be interested in helping us do some of these surveys. I said, sure, yeah. And so these are some of those vernal pools on the Table Rocks during the wet season and the same pool during the dry season. And so I had just two spectacular students that were working with me who sampled all the pools on the Agate Desert, on Table Rock, at Denman, and places like that. And I'm not going to say much more about that because Rebecca's going to talk about some of the things that we found in those vernal pools. But guess what? Very different than my desert Southwest temporary waters, but many of the same groups of organisms were inhabiting these vernal pools as well as what we saw down there. And so as a biologist, it's like, WTF, evolution, right? That stands for, wow, that's fantastic. And so it's sort of, how does this happen? And when you think about temporary waters, you think about any harsh environments like this that dry up, that freeze, that get hot. there are really only a couple of ways organisms can make a go of it there. And I've simplified this tremendously, but really when you think about it, there's two things. You can resist that kind of environmental harshness, or you can avoid it. You can be opportunistic and you can come and go when conditions are good. Or you can have some sort of adaptation that lets you dry out, get hot, get cold, or avoid it altogether and recolonize those kind of habitats when the conditions are okay. So that's going to be kind of the theme here. And I just want to point out some of the organisms that have different kinds of adaptations for these different environments. And anybody here, how many people have actually gone on a tour to the Table Rocks or someplace else with a little aquarium net and a white pan in your hand and scooped water out and thrown it in the pan? What do you see when you scoop that water and empty that net in?
I didn't listen to your whole question. I just did the first part.
You did listen, or you didn't listen to it?
I answered before I heard your whole question.
Wow. And I didn't hear your answer. So just shout it out. What do you see when you empty the net into the pan of water? There's all kinds of stuff in there, right? And it's swimming around and it's moving around and little stuff and big stuff. And what's that?
Tiny.
Tiny. Some's tiny, some's not so tiny. But they're the same suite of organisms that live in those rock pools in that dry lake bed and things like that. Oh, 7 minutes. Okay. Am I talking fast enough? Perfect. And so I just threw together this collage of some of my favorite invertebrate taxa that live in these pools. Things like flatworms or aquatic earthworms, little roundworms, water mites. Water mites are really interesting. Rotifers, snails, fingernail clams, there's a whole bunch of different things. And they all have one thing in common, and that is they have evolved adaptations that allow them to resist drying up, freezing, getting too hot, and those kinds of things. Mostly it's related to their reproduction. They produce eggs that can withstand that. Some of them have other life history characteristics. There's a couple of vernal pool snails that live in Oregon and Washington vernal pools that literally burrow down into the sediment 6 to 8 inches and then secrete a bunch of mucus and sort of make themselves into a snot cocoon and can live down there for 2 to 3 years, even during the summer. And then when the water comes back, they emerge and go about doing their business. Mites are interesting because in some cases they hitchhike in on flying insects that recolonize the ponds, and then they drop off and go through a couple of life stages, and then their eggs can be resistant. So all kinds of things have resistant stages. Tardigrades on the moon, where the heck did that come from? When people think about how do organisms live in environments that dry up, your 50-cent word for tonight is anhydrobiosis, in the absence of water. And the poster organism for anhydrobiosis that everybody knows about are tardigrades, water bears, these tiny little organisms, right? So that's a tardigrade on the moon. People are really interested in tardigrades because what they do is they replace the water in their tissues with other things like sugars and special kinds of proteins. And so they've been used in space exploration and doing experiments of how organisms could live in space. And it turns out that an Israeli spacecraft that was carrying an experiment with tardigrades actually crashed into the moon. And so there may be tardigrades on the moon. Okay. But I digress. But that's how these organisms do it, is they can change the structure of the molecules in their cells that allows them to withstand those environments. And the organisms that most people are familiar with in vernal pools and the stars of the show are the crustaceans. They're not the only ones, but the crustaceans are the ones that people go to see because they're big and they're interesting. And so here's a group of crustaceans that you might find in vernal pools. And mostly they produce what people refer to as resting stages. So they reproduce in the pool, they release these resting stages that then when the water comes back, during good environmental conditions, they can grow and reproduce and get through their life cycle pretty quickly. So things like seed shrimp. These are those little pieces of pepper that swim around in your white pan when you scoop it up with your copepods. These are the really big things that sort of hop around in the water, and they can be bright red because of the pigments. Seed shrimp and tadpole shrimp, fairy shrimp, they're all crustaceans, and they all sort of have this life cycle that allows them to produce these resting stages. And these two are pictures from a former student of mine, Jay Dowino, who after the discovery of vernal pool fairy shrimp in the Agate Desert, Jay did for his master's thesis, he went out and sampled the dry sediments in the summer, extracted the, they call them cysts. What they are is they're actually an embryo of about 8 to 16, up to 32, depending on species, cells that have divided after sexual reproduction. And then they invest it with this covering that allows them to completely dry out. And this is a cyst of Eubranchibus oregonus, the Oregon fairy shrimp, and here's the cyst of Branchionecta lynchi, the vernal pool fairy shrimp. You can actually identify them to species based on their cyst. There are fairy shrimp that it's been predicted in some parts of the world that in this life stage, it's an embryo developing inside that cyst, can persist for centuries. When Denton Belt came out after the discovery of the vernal pool fairy shrimp, we were talking about it, and he has a paper where they estimated one species could live up to 600 plus years in that stage. So when some kid comes along with his yogurt can and scoops up some sediment and puts it in a, that was no big deal. Okay, I'm gonna go quick. So that's resistance. One quick story here about water fleas. In Daphne, everybody's seen water fleas in their general biology. They do something really cool, and this is something a lot of different aquatic organisms can do, but it's really represented here. Most of the water fleas you see in your net when you dump it in your pan are females. And when they first hatch out in the spring, they're all females, and they all reproduce parthenogenically, meaning they don't have sex. So what happens is they just produce clones of themselves. So here's a water flea, and all these little babies back here are clones of mom. And at some point, that pool starts to dry out, conditions start to go to hell in a handbasket, and they get a signal, and it turns on certain genes that then cause them to create not only parthenogenic daughters, but parthenogenic sons. And they also produce haploid eggs. Now, this isn't a biology lecture, so it doesn't matter. It's just eggs that can be fertilized. And they can be fertilized by the parthenogenic sons of another fairy shrimp. And basically what happens is they go from asexual reproduction to sexual reproduction, which does one really important thing, which is increases the genetic diversity of the population so that they can adapt well to changing environments. They have sex, and the offspring are just like that resting stage of the fairy shrimp. Well, actually, they're not just like it, but they're similar, analogous to it. And they form this egg case that takes those developing embryos, encases it in a hard substance, and that's what gets deposited in the bottom of that vernal pool. Now, those can last also decades, maybe centuries, not really clear. And here's a fun word too. These are called epipial eggs or epippeal eggs. And what that stands for is on top of a horse. Epihippus. Hippus is the genus for horse, right? The first limnologist with a microscope looked at that and said, it looks like there's a saddle on the back of that fairy shrimp. And so these are epippeal eggs that rest in the sediment. When they hatch out in the spring, they all are female. And they all reproduce parthenogenic. Rotifers do it. Fairy shrimp do it. Wouldn't it be great if we could do it? Nah. Okay. One really famous Why am I drawing a blank on these guys? Cladoceran, and this is the hairy fairy shrimp, which was found in the collection, or I keep wanting to say fairy shrimp. The water flea, this is the hairy water flea. It was collected in that collection that my students collected in 1997, 1998, and were sent off to specialists to identify things that nobody knew what they were. And it turns out that Dumontia was not just a new species, it was a new family of water fleas found in the vernal pools, and only from 3 pools that we know of. And Stanley Dodson, who was one of the authors on the paper at the University of Wisconsin, is the one who described it. And here's some diagrams of the hairy swimming legs of the hairy water flea that Stanley and his student described. Unfortunately, well, I won't go into that story about Stanley. So algae do it. A lot of other organisms do it. You go to a vernal pool, and sometimes in the spring, after a few days of rain, it'll be nice and green and fuzzy like this. It's because algae also have resting stages. I'm going to leave it at that because I'm out of time. So those are the resistants. There are also a lot of organisms that recolonize, and some of the bigger things that you see in the ponds are mostly insects, and they're things that can fly. And when conditions get good, they're filled with water, you've got all that food in there, right? All those other things have reproduced. And so you get things like predaceous diving beetles that will fly in as an adult, lay their eggs, and their babies hatch out and become the Wrath of Khan monster from the Star Wars movie. And they grow really rapidly because there's lots for them to eat. And by the time things start to go to hell in a handbasket, what do? These become these, and they take off and fly again. There are a lot of insects that do that, including the water bugs, including if you've got a lot of amphibians in your vernal pool, there's the giant water bug that's about 3 inches long that can fly in and feed on those amphibians and then fly out when he's done. Pretty scary. The water mites love to travel as parasites on water boatmen and then colonize the ponds that way. So, and then there's some insects that do both. They have a resistant stage, and then they have a recolonization stage. So there's one particular type of caddisfly. Most people know caddisflies from streams and lakes. This caddisfly will actually spend its time as an adult on vegetation in a dormant stage and then go in and lay its eggs before the ponds fill up. So lots of ways that things have evolved to do that, including a couple of vertebrates. And for the vertebrates, we've got 2 in our region that live in vernal pools, the Pacific chorus frog and long-toed salamander. And the way they do it is they get in early, they reproduce, they grow fast, they metamorphose quickly. No other amphibians or other vertebrates can complete their life cycle fast enough to live in those kind of temporary waters. Go anywhere in the Western United States where you've got rock pools or you've got dry lake beds or things like that, and you're going to find at least one amphibian that can do that. If you go to the Southeast Oregon, you'll find a spadefoot toad that does what those snails do, and that is it digs itself down into the mud, excretes a snot cocoon, and can live there for the dry season until it comes back out. Okay, so one last thing. I'm not done studying these things. They're so cool. And I've discovered a bunch of vernal pools up in the Cascade-Siskiyou National Monument up to about 5,000 feet elevation. One of the same fairy shrimp that lives in the Agate Desert, well, actually in the whetstone savanna, also lives up here. And we're talking about doing some work to compare those 2. So Rebecca's going to now tell you about fairy shrimp. And I'm sorry I went over.
Thank you so much. I learn something new every time I talk to you, and today it was not cocoons. So, I never knew. Anyway, next we have our very own Rebecca. She is a member of SOLC's Land Stewardship Team, and she earned a Bachelor of Science in Biology locally at SOU, and a Master of Science in Biological Science, that's a lot of sciences and biology, from California State University, Sacramento. And she has worked in vernal pool conservation and restoration from Fresno to Medford.
Great. Tara and I are about the same height, so this is perfect. So we're going to talk about fantastic fairies and where to find them. I love fairy shrimp, and I'm hoping by the end of this talk, everyone here will love them at least half as much as I do, which is still a lot. So open your hearts for these charismatic microfauna. Yeah, everyone loves etymology, so I thought I'd start there. They're in the class Brachiopoda. The brachio is for gill, poda for feet. They have gilled feet. We'll talk about their feet a little later. In the order Anostracod, they don't have shells. Other creatures in their class do have shells, like the tadpole shrimp. These guys do, they still have an exoskeleton, but not the hardened shell. There are 8 total families and at least 300 species. I think I saw 314 in the last list. For anyone panicking, trying to remember everything about class, order, phylum, all of that, I did do a nice list with a picture to help you remember. Kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Kings play chess on fine-grained sand. So if you don't learn about fairy shrimp, you at least remember that. In Oregon, we have 4 families represented and 4 genera. And 15 total species. We'll have 2 that we'll talk about for the Agate Desert. I do have a favorite, and is the giant fairy shrimp. A lot of our fairy shrimp are about yay big, and this one's like yay big. So huge. About those feet, they're known as the Phylopodia, phyla for leaf, poda, feet. They have beautiful little leaf-like feet. There's 11 pairs of them. So they have 22. So if you like double how many hands I have, you're still one finger short from doing a whole representation. These feet are fashionable and functional. Not only are they used for locomotion, where they're graceful back swimmers and they go around the pool, but they're also used to actually breathe because there are gills in the feet, and to bring food up to the mouth. So I have this beautiful male vernal pool fairy shrimp who's gonna do 3 things at once. Good job, buddy. Oh, he was handsome. Dr. Parker did talk about the cysts that they have, so I want to talk a little bit about mating strategy because it's the end of the night and everyone's had a couple drinks. The male will come up and clasp the female, they mate, and the embryonic development starts almost immediately. And then it comes to a pause, a diapause for your word, where it'll slow the it'll stop growth. The female will excrete from a shell gland and develop those shells, and each species really does have its own unique shell. This picture right here is 3 different species represented. It's kind of like birds also have unique shells. So if you're trying to figure out a bird shell egg, it has a special species. The great thing about these cysts is that they can withstand boiling, freezing, desiccation, the vacuum of space. I don't know who tested these things, but it does mean that we can have fairy shrimp and tardigrades in space, and I'm very excited. And very important, they also survive digestive enzymes. Not sure if they'd go through mine, but they do go through birds. So a bird will go through a pool, chew up a female, fly to another pool, do its business, drop the cysts. So that's how you can have the fairy shrimp going. Well, we'll look at it later, but globally, it is a global group of organisms. I just wanted to show their baby picture because they're really cute. When they get to the right circumstance, a lot of them, it's like how long they've been in contact with moisture and a temperature. They hatch, they have 1 eye, 3 appendages, they go through repeated moltings and then have 11 pairs of legs, which they can swim with, eat with, and breathe with. Recap. Global. I thought this was a great picture because I made it. We have our families over here. That's the fine and the fine grained sand. And you can see how the families get spread out through the globe. In North America, we have 5 families that do show up. Oregon, it is those 4, which you probably can't see in the back, and I'm sorry. But here, because we're doing Agate Desert night, we have 2 species that show up in the Agate Desert. We have the, I know there's a way to do, nope. That's the vernal pool fairy shrimp. And next to it, we have the Oregon fairy shrimp. The vernal pool fairy shrimp, we'll talk about this, but it is an endangered species, and the Oregon fairy shrimp isn't, but we only have it at one of the pools that, one of the properties that SLC currently manages. And it is really cute. The Oregon fairy shrimp, that's Eubrynchus oregonus, I'm gonna get it right. They're about 0.8 to 1.1 inches or 2 to 3 centimeters. They can live about 25 weeks, which is a very long-lived fairy shrimp. And I'm gonna show, and they're beautiful. I'm gonna be honest, I took this video in February and I accidentally sat in the vernal pool because I was just so enamored with how gorgeous this shrimp looked. There is a typical, that's what it looks like when you watch people sample pools. It's really attractive. But that's from our Whetstone Savanna Preserve. The Oregon fairy shrimp have been showing up a lot under in the oak trees in the vernal pools there. I don't have a good reason why. And we also have the vernal pool fairy shrimp. This is the one that we talk about the most because it is the endangered species. Here I have a video of some really iconic habitat that you would find them in. This is on a conserved piece of property that's under private ownership. And I should have blown that up. You can see his face right there. Because it's an endangered species, you do have to be permitted to handle it. I do have a permit, it's fine. These guys they're a little shorter than the Oregon fairy shrimp, but not by much. It's a lot to them, but to me, it's 1/10 of an inch. And part of their life cycle is limited by the vernal pool, like the Oregon fairy shrimp. And we know they've had extensive studies that it's about 40 days for reproduction. So they need just under 6 weeks to fully go from hatching to being able to produce cysts. And they need those pools to be full long enough at the right temperature for that. And that'll kind of tie into why they might be endangered. So this species was first designated as its own species in 1990. It was only known to be in California. And by 94, it got listed as an endangered species under the Federal Endangered Species Act, along with a couple other fairy shrimps that are in Oregon. In 98, Deidre Dean and Joseph Kiernan, 2 students working for Dr. Michael Parker, found this species in Oregon, 130 miles north of the next closest population in California. So some poor bird held their bladder for 130 miles at least. That's my theory. So part of them being listed is when you go to a vernal pool and you see this shrimp, you'll see quite a few of them, and it's really rewarding and they're gorgeous. Part of why they're endangered is their habitat is endangered. In California, they've lost 90% of their vernal pools. In the Agate Desert, we've lost, it sounds like 83% now. And we're losing it to things like construction, to agriculture, to just development. Wow, that's a downer. Let me show you a video of them being cute. I was also trying really hard to do a tongue twister. So if anyone wants to try this, very fun fairies find vertical flitting fantastic. No. Okay. Okay, we're gonna count it out. 1, 2, 3.
Fantastic.
Great. I need to get a better tongue twister because you did it fine. And this was my favorite video from this sampling season. The shrimp are so abundant in this pool that I just had to dip a vial in and I got a male and a female. And they're so beautiful. So that's all I got.
Thank you so much, Tessa. I love how much you love fairies. It makes me really happy. And it is so I'm going to be in the field during fairy shrimp season because it's a little like a kid in a candy shop. And you just can't help but be as excited. It's amazing. Now, I do want to say this is your very last chance to get a raffle ticket or 6. If you want to get your hands on that beautiful bottle of wine and putting on wine with friends. So Amber, you're out, you're good. Get it, get in there. She'll be circulating, while we have our fabulous Kristen Dollar. She is our stewardship director at SLP and a botanist for the special interest in rare plants. Yours.
Thank you, Tara. So I'm here to talk about the charismatic itty bitty flora of the Agate Desert. And this is a time where many humans suffer from plant blindness, where we don't know the common plant neighbors in our neighborhood. We don't know which plants can hurt us or help us. We don't know the plants that native peoples find important in our region, including the lovely Harley. It's a kind of impoverishment. It's a drought. We've lost our connections to our plant kin, but most humans respond to fields of flowers. And in the Agate Desert, we have rings around the pools, we have ribbons of flowers, we have patches of flowers of ephemeral beauty. The major life strategy for vernal pool plants parallels the invertebrates: live fast, die young. Within 3 weeks, a plant can flower and set seed. Those seeds endure from one dry season, sometimes multiple dry seasons, till they find the right conditions and then they reach for the sun. Similar to that are specialist pollinator bees, digger bees, some of which specialize in vernal pool flowers, like the goldfields, the meadow foams. Am I echoing too much? And the calico flowers, like this pretty purple one here. When the calico flowers come out, the female solitary bee, an adrena bee, she comes and collects pollen. Then she builds a nest in the ground. These bees need bare ground. She provisions her nest with the pollen. And then when the young grow up and eat their pollen, they can wait for a year or 2 or 3 or 4 until the next magical time they know that the plant that they need is blooming. The Agate Desert fosters many rare plants, and I'm just going to talk about a couple. This is the large flower woolly meadow foam. It is federally endangered and is only known in the Agate Desert. It grows along the vernal pool margins. And it is woolly, and it is large flowered. Relative to the plant body being about this big, it's mostly flower. This group of flowers, the Lamianthus bees, the meadow foams, there aren't that many species, and all of them occur in Western North America. Many of them, though, are very narrowly restricted. For instance, this one, this lovely little flower, the dwarf meadow foam, only grows on the top of upper and lower Table Rock. That is it. There's another rare meadowfoam that grows to the east in the Cascades, another one that grows to the west in the Illinois Valley. Interestingly, there is a species that's grown as a crop in the Willamette Valley. It's the white meadowfoam. Another federally listed species is Cook's limation or biscuit root or Cook's desert parsley. And it also grows along the pool margins. It also does grow in the Illinois Valley in a few select vernal meadows, often on serpentine soils. There it grows with the rare slender meadowfoam or graceful meadowfoam. Here is one of our beautiful volunteers helping us have the Cook's limation. She's right there. One of the biggest threats to the plants of our agate desert are the introduction of invasive non-native annual grasses from Eurasia. This one in particular is called Medusa head. It doesn't live very long, but when it dies, the stems are full of silica, and eventually a thatch builds up to the point where flowers can't grow through it and the pollinators that need them. One major tool for managing Medusa head, as we've already heard, is prescribed fire. Here's a prescribed fire conducted by the Nature Conservancy at Agate Desert Preserve in 2017. We're planning on burning with their mentorship again this year. Another tool is managed seasonal grazing of cattle and sheep, which can also remove the thatch. I want to conclude my very itty-bitty talk with featuring some of the other animals that use the agate desert. So in the 1800s, pronghorn antelope grazed the agate desert. They are gone. Badgers made burrows in the agate desert. They seem to be gone. We had breeding colonies not too long ago of the beautiful burrowing owls using the badger burrows in the agate desert, and they are mostly gone. However, this little creature and other rodents persist. This is the Bota's pocket gopher. It grazes on the plants of the agate desert. It is food for wildlife and raptors, and it helps maintain meadows. It's an important disturbance agent, and it's been implicated as one of the main reasons that the mounds of the vernal pool meadow prairie are maintained. So thank you, Bota's pocket gopher. Thank you all for hearing about the agate desert. The end.
So good. When I was Rebecca and the fairy shrimp, when I'm in the field with Christy, the open-hearted joy of flowers is infectious, and it is such a pleasure to be in the field with you, especially this time of year. Now, to close out our evening, we have Steve Wise, our executive director. I hope you got your raffle tickets. This is going to pull a winning one. So, Steve.
Give me this.
No. Okay, keep buying those raffle tickets. I'm going to say a couple of things, but very briefly. I'm the one that gets to say thank you. I get to thank our presenters, David, Michael, Pat, Christy, and Tara, and Rebecca. There's so much knowledge that they have to share here, and it shows, why are we all here? Because we are a conservation organization. We aspire to permanently preserve and conserve the most valuable lands and the most valuable living systems that we can with the best knowledge that we have. So we're here to learn together, right? You came to learn. You came because we share this curiosity. We share this fascination and a commitment to do something about it. It's a world in crisis. We're losing these environments quickly. We've lost 80 to 90% of the ones we're talking about here. But this is our moment. It's another of the pieces of native wisdom that we've learned from sharing knowledge with indigenous people. We are here now because we have a chance to do what can be done now. And this is what we're here for. So while we're here learning tonight, we can look at this long string of culture, the long history of science that we've learned. We can look at past mistakes and failures. That's one of my favorite things, failure. As that great cultural and lifelong learner Yoda said, failure your greatest teacher is. You know, we have to look at the things that didn't work before, the mistakes that we made, but we have a chance to do something different. We have a chance to look ahead and make and have an impact on the future. And this is what we're here to do, even if we're just here drinking beer and eating fried food at the moment. What we've learned, we can apply. And what we've learned about this unique and fascinating little slice of the Agate Desert applies to the Rogue Valley. It applies, as Rebecca said, globally. We're looking at the microcosm of the vernal pools and their fascinating lives, and the mounded prairies and their plants and the animals and the people that have been interdependent for all these years, and then deciding how we can best use our energy, our action to benefit the life that surrounds us. So that's what we're really here to work on together, and we're so glad that you're here to share it with us. How can we do more of this together, right? That's what you really want to know. Well, we've got a couple of ideas. We have our spring hike series that's about to open up, great chances to visit not only the Agate Desert preserves, but some of the other public preserves that SOLC is a part of protecting and conserving for time immemorial going forward. It's permanent protection for the long future. What a joy to think about the future and be able to do something about it. Our conservation celebration is coming up on May 13th. We invite you all to come and join that celebration and look at more of the work that we're doing together and the more of the work that can be done when we join forces, when we invest in the future by conserving the present. The theme this year is to conserve today and ensure tomorrow. This is exactly what we're talking about through all of this discussion tonight. But for the moment, we also want to live in this present moment because you are all winners because you came here tonight. And one of you, just one person, right? One of you is going to be the winner of our raffle prize. So we'll get to the prize winning because we're all going to go home winners, but somebody's going to get a special prize for it. So the number, is it a name or a number on here? No. The number?
Number, yeah.
Number, if I can read it.
Oh,
I might need somebody with glasses or better light. And the number is, this is Amber Shannon.
hello.
Amber is our new event and volunteer coordinator. Give her a big hand for organizing her first event tonight. Another victory for another person who's joined us. And the number is?
The number is 027154.
154. Who's got 154?
Valentino.
Hey, a lucky winner. Excellent. So without further ado, please enjoy your wine. Enjoy more. Thanks again for our servers and our cooks back in the kitchen. We thank you. Anybody who snacked for coming out for an extra night. They're working overtime for our joy and benefit. We thank you so much. And we're going to have a little mingling time, I think, until 8 o'clock. So thanks again for coming. We're looking forward to seeing you for the rest of the year at more events. Enjoy the evening and enjoy the Agate Desert. Thank you.